March 1945. As Allied forces prepared to cross the Rhine River, the final gateway into Nazi Germany, American soldiers faced an enemy army that didn't exist. Tanks rumbled through the mist, radio chatter filled the air. Even German scouts reported an entire division assembling near the front line. But it was all fake. Inflatable tanks, recorded gunfire, a phantom force created not to fight but to deceive. This is the untold story of Operation Viersen, the day the Allies built an army of ghosts and fooled Hitler himself into defending the wrong riverbank. Chapter 1. The Rhine Dilemma. By early March 1945, the war in Europe was reaching its inevitable end, but the path to final victory lay behind one of nature's oldest defenses, the Rhine River. 1,000 kilometers long, fed by the snowmelt of the Alps, the Rhine cut through the heart of Germany like a living wall. It had protected empires for centuries, Roman legions, Prussian armies, and now the crumbling Wehrmacht. For the Allies, it was both a challenge and a symbol. To cross it meant breaking into Hitler's last fortress, the German homeland itself. But to fail meant another winter of war, more dead, more destruction. Every bridge had been blown up on Hitler's orders. Every crossing point was mined and guarded. And behind those riverbanks, tens of thousands of German troops waited, many of them teenagers, others old men from the Volkssturm, armed with Panzerfausts, rifles, and a fanatic order. The Rhine shall not be crossed. The Allied commanders knew the task ahead wasn't just a military operation. It was a psychological test. Germany's defenses were weak but unpredictable, its communication lines broken, its morale fragile but dangerous. If the Allies charged the Rhine without a plan, they would be walking into a trap. General Omar Bradley, overseeing the 12th Army Group, understood this better than anyone. He told his staff, "If we strike where they expect us, we'll pay for every meter in blood." The goal was clear: find a way across the Rhine without alerting Hitler's armies. But how do you cross a river the enemy watches day and night? How do you move tens of thousands of men, vehicles, and supplies without anyone noticing? The answer didn't come from generals or soldiers. It came from artists. In a quiet corner of France, far from the front lines, an unusual American unit was preparing for something extraordinary. Their soldiers didn't carry rifles or grenades. They carried paint, rubber, amplifiers, and radio transmitters. They were the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, better known today as the Ghost Army. Their orders were unlike any in military history: to create an entire illusion of an army, a force so convincing that German spies, pilots, and generals would shift defenses toward it, leaving the real crossing routes undefended. Meanwhile, reconnaissance photos showed German troops reinforcing the Rhine near Düsseldorf and Wesel. Allied planners realized this could work to their advantage by feeding that fear, by making the Germans believe that the next Allied invasion would come from there. The plan became known as Operation Viersen. It would be one of the last and boldest deception campaigns of the war. Its objective: convince Hitler's generals that the U.S. Ninth Army under General William Simpson was massing near the Rhine opposite Düsseldorf, ready to cross at dawn. In reality, the real crossing would happen miles away, near Remagen, where American forces had already discovered an intact bridge, the Ludendorff Bridge, the last surviving passage over the Rhine. While the world's attention would soon focus on that historic crossing, the success of Remagen depended on one thing: the Germans not knowing it was happening. And that S where the artists of illusion went to work. In the fields around Viersen, trucks began to move, tents appeared overnight, and entire divisions seemed to materialize out of nowhere. From the air, it looked like an army assembling for war. On the ground, it was an elaborate lie made of canvas, paint, and sound. The stage was set, the Rhine was waiting, and the War S, most unlikely soldiers, painters, set designers, and engineers, were about to perform the greatest illusion Europe had ever seen. Chapter 2. The Artists of War. Before the first fake tank ever rolled onto a German field, before the first phantom radio signal crackled across the airwaves, a secret unit had been quietly training for a war unlike any other. They called themselves the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, but to the few who knew of their existence, they were simply the Ghost Army, a collection of artists, architects, engineers, and showmen armed with creativity instead of gunpowder. They didn't storm beaches or hold trenches. Their job was to make noise, cast shadows, and fool the enemy. And they were brilliant at it. Of the Ghost Army was born in 1944, after Allied commanders realized that deception could save lives. British intelligence had already perfected the art with Operation Fortitude, the fake army that convinced Hitler the D-Day landings would come at Calais instead of Normandy. The Americans wanted their own unit capable of pulling off similar feats, a traveling illusion that could imitate entire divisions and vanish overnight. So the U.S. Army gathered the unlikeliest collection of men imaginable. Painters from the Art Students League of New York, sound engineers from Hollywood, set designers from Broadway, and even fashion illustrators who would one day become legends among them. Bill Blass, who later founded one of America's most iconic clothing brands. To these men, camouflage and costume were the same thing, just with higher stakes. One boy, their training was equal parts art class and espionage. At Fort Meade, Maryland, recruits learned how to fake everything: unit markings, tire tracks, even the casual chatter of soldiers around campfires. They were taught to think like stage magicians, to guide the enemy SIs exactly where they wanted. If you could make the Germans believe there were 30,000 men behind a tree line, you didn't need 30,000 men, you just needed to make it look that way. Their motto became a quiet promise: we deceive, therefore we win. By the time the Ghost Army landed in France in 1944, they had developed three powerful weapons of illusion. 1. Visual deception, inflatable tanks, rubber jeeps, fake artillery, and dummy planes that could be set up in hours. From the air, they looked real enough to fool reconnaissance photos. 2. Sonic deception giant loudspeakers mounted on trucks that played pre-recorded sounds of tanks, artillery, and troop movements. The recordings, made by engineers from Bell Labs, could simulate a full armored division moving through terrain right down to the clanking of tracks and the rumble of engines. 3. Radio deception skilled operators mimicked the communication patterns of real divisions, transmitting fake orders and coordinates in perfect rhythm. The Germans, who were experts at radio interception, fell for it again and again. It was part theater, part science, part pure nerve. The Ghost Army's first big tests came after D-Day, when they were used to divert German attention during the Allied push across France. At one point, just 1,100 men successfully impersonated a force of 30,000, complete with fake tanks, sound effects, and dummy headquarters. It worked so well that German artillery began shelling empty fields. But Operation Viersen would be their masterpiece, Their mission to convince Hitler's generals that the next Allied invasion would come near Dusseldorf, not Remagen. To do it, they needed to build a fake army big enough to fool both ground scouts and Luftwaffe reconnaissance, and to sell the illusion. Every tiny detail had to be perfect. For days, trucks filled with inflatable tanks and fake artillery rolled into position. Canvas half-tracks were inflated and painted with unit insignias. Soldiers hung laundry on lines to make camps look lived in. Mess tents gave off cooking smoke made by smoke grenades and diesel burners. Even the jeep tracks were carefully arranged to match the movements of a real army. To any observer, German or Allied, it looked completely real. But it wasn't. It was a stage set for one of the greatest performances in military history. One Ghost Army veteran later said, "We were artists with a deadline. If we fooled the Germans, men lived. If we didn't, men died." As night fell, the sound trucks began to play. Engines growled. Boots marched. Somewhere across the river, German spotters leaned forward, listening to what they thought was an American division forming up for an assault. They had no idea they were listening to an illusion. Chapter 3. The Art of Illusion. The night sky over the Rhine was too quiet for what German intelligence believed was coming. They were expecting the roar of engines, the thunder of artillery, the movement of tens of thousands of men preparing to cross the river. And in a way, they were right, because on March 18, 1945, an entire army did appear near the town of Viersen, but it was an army made of rubber, sound, and imagination. And from a distance, the scene was indistinguishable from a real military buildup. Floodlights glowed faintly through the mist. Convoys rumbled down country roads. Cranes appeared to lift pontoon bridges into place. And through binoculars, Luftwaffe spotters reported hundreds of tanks massed behind the hedgerows near the Rhine. In reality, the tanks were inflatable models painted by hand, secured with stakes, and inflated with air compressors. Each one could be carried by 4 men, packed into a truck, and set up in 30 minutes. From the air, they looked completely authentic. Metallic reflections painted onto rubber, shadows drawn beneath the turrets, even fake fuel stains added to make them appear used. To anyone watching from above, it looked like the U.S. 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions were preparing for a major crossing of the Rhine. But the illusion didn't stop at visuals. It had to sound real, too. That S, where the sonic deception teams came in. Using enormous 500-pound loudspeakers mounted on trucks, they blasted recordings of tanks moving, engineers building bridges, and soldiers shouting commands. Recordings created by Bell Labs engineers were based on actual sounds from real armored units. They even adjusted for terrain, the echo of a tank engine bouncing off a riverbank versus the dull thump of tracks in mud. At night, the Germans could hear it all: the roar of Sherman engines, the grind of machinery, the metallic clatter of pontoon bridges being assembled. One Wehrmacht officer later wrote in his diary, "They are preparing a crossing. You can hear the tanks and the engineers working through the night." He was listening to a recording. To complete the illusion, the Ghost Army deployed its third weapon, radio deception. Trained operators transmitted fake messages using the same call signs and code phrases as real American divisions. Every detail matched: message timing, tone, even the level of background static. German intelligence, which had long intercepted Allied transmissions, tracked these signals and confirmed what they already knew. The Americans were preparing to cross near Viersen. Hitler's generals swallowed. the bait hole. Meanwhile, the real American assault force, dozens of miles to the south near Remagen, moved silently under the cover of darkness. They had already captured the Ludendorff Bridge intact, a miracle that gave them a direct path across the Rhine. But if the Germans had realized how vulnerable that position was, they could have launched a devastating counterattack. Instead, thanks to the Ghost Army, German artillery and reinforcements were being diverted north toward a phantom army that didn't exist. Back at Viersen, the deception grew even bolder. Engineers lit fake campfires and placed dummy mannequins around them to create the illusion of resting soldiers. Jeeps with loudspeakers drove in loops, simulating constant movement through the area. Even tire tracks were carved into the mud with special rollers to make it appear that heavy tanks had passed. For 72 hours straight, the fake army pulsed with activity. From the air, it was the definition of authenticity. From the ground, it was a theater production of war. One soldier from the 23rd later said, "It was like painting a picture that could save lives, except our paint was smoke, sound, and rubber." By the time the Germans realized their mistake, the Allies were already across the Rhine in full force, a deception so successful that German high command refused to believe the true crossing had even happened until it was too late. For the men of the Ghost Army, it was the pinnacle of their strange silent war. They had fought not with bullets, but with imagination, and won. Chapter 4. The Phantom Broadcasts. The success of any illusion depends on more than what people see. It depends on what they believe. And in 1945, belief traveled fastest through the airwaves. The Ghost Army's visual and sound deception had built a perfect illusion, but it was the radio operators who gave it life a heartbeat that the German military could detect and trace. This was the art of the invisible conversation. Each Allied division in Europe had its own distinct radio fingerprint. The rhythm of transmissions, the tone of operators, the patterns of call signs, all were unique and meticulously tracked by German signals intelligence. The Ghost Army had studied this system in detail. If they were to sell their fake invasion, their transmissions had to sound exactly like those of the 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions, the real units they were impersonating. So they began by listening. Before Operation Viersen, radio experts from the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops spent weeks monitoring the real divisions. They recorded message timing, spacing, and even the pauses between responses. When the real units pulled back to prepare for the crossing elsewhere, the Ghost Army took over their radio. Frequencies and the illusion continued without a single break in transmission. To German intelligence, nothing had changed. The 30th Division was still sitting on the Rhine, sending updates about bridge repairs, troop reinforcements, and artillery positioning. Every word was fake. Every coordinate was meaningless, but it was convincing enough to send German analysts into overdrive. Meanwhile, fake messages began to pour in from supporting units. The Ghost Army simulated an entire command structure, regimental officers, logistics battalions, engineering corps, all transmitting over the air. They even mimicked radio static patterns to match the terrain, knowing that signals from low valleys would sound weaker, while high ground broadcasts were cleaner and sharper. This was deception at a mathematical level, the careful orchestration of noise to manufacture credibility. The Germans, of course, were listening. Their intercept stations along the Ruhr and Wesel crackled with Allied chatter. They cross-referenced the frequencies with previous intelligence reports, and everything matched. By March 22nd, Hitler's general staff had concluded that a major U.S. crossing was imminent between Dusseldorf and Krefeld, exactly where the Ghost Army wanted them to look. They began shifting reinforcements, redeploying artillery, and even repositioning anti-aircraft guns to counter the phantom assault. Every tank they moved north was one fewer defending the real crossing. Inside the Ghost Army-esque command tent, the deception teams worked with the precision of stage actors hitting cues. Operators followed detailed scripts, reading fake coordinates, sending coded reports about weather conditions, and requesting fictional bridge supplies. Some transmissions were pure improvisation officers chatting casually about supply delays, mess hall rumors, or upcoming leave days, all intended to sound mundane enough to be believable. The more ordinary the message, the more convincing the illusion. At night, the sound trucks added to the performance, playing distant artillery rumble while spotlights swept across the sky to simulate activity. It was a symphony of deception, light, sound, and radio blending into one coordinated act of misdirection. One operator, Sergeant Jack Macy, later recalled, "You had to think like the enemy. What would make you believe an army was there? Then you build that belief, one lie at a time." By the time Operation Viersen reached its peak, German reconnaissance aircraft were flying frantic missions over the area, photographing what they thought was the spearhead of a major Allied offensive. They captured hundreds of images of tanks, trucks, and pontoon bridges, none of which were real. Those photos were delivered to Berlin and shown to Hitler's senior staff. The Führer himself reportedly ordered reserves to the area, convinced the main Allied thrust would come there. He had taken the bait completely. But meanwhile, 50 miles south, the 1st and 9th U.S. armies had already begun their real crossing. Under cover of darkness, pontoon bridges stretched silently across the Rhine. By dawn, thousands of troops were streaming into Germany, while German artillery remained pointed at empty fields. The Ghost Army-esque phantom broadcasts had achieved the impossible. They had made Hitler defend a battle that would never happen. One of the Unit's radio operators summed it up perfectly years later. "Our weapons were lies. Our ammunition was time, and we won because the enemy never realized he was fighting an illusion." Chapter 5. The Real Crossing. While the Ghost Army-esque inflatable tanks loomed over empty fields and phantom broadcasts echoed through the night, the real war, the one that would break Hitler's last defensive line, was already underway, miles to the south. It began quietly, almost invisibly, on the misty evening of March 23, 1945. The Rhine shimmered under moonlight, calm and indifferent, but behind its banks, thousands of men waited in silence. They were about to do what every German commander had sworn was impossible: cross the Rhine under enemy fire. In the darkness near Remagen, Oppenheim, and Wessel, pontoon engineers moved like ghosts of their own. They dragged boats through mud, uncoiled ropes in total silence, and laid planks across the black water. No shouting, no lights, just the muffled rhythm of war in its quietest form. Above them, Allied artillery opened up, a storm of fire meant to drown out the sound of their advance. The sky turned crimson as flares and tracer rounds danced across the horizon. But on the northern stretch of the Rhine, where the Ghost Army had stationed its fake divisions, the guns were silent. German artillery there was waiting for a phantom. At Remagen, days earlier, the Americans had captured something almost unbelievable: an intact steel bridge, the Ludendorff Bridge. It was the last surviving bridge over the Rhine, abandoned by retreating Germans who failed to destroy it in time. When American scouts first spotted it, they couldn't believe their luck. They radioed back, in disbelief. The bridge is still standing. What followed was one of the boldest moves of the entire war. On March 7, 1945, under sniper fire and collapsing girders, American troops stormed across the bridge, establishing the first Allied foothold on the east bank of the Rhine. It was a strategic miracle and a psychological catastrophe for the Germans. Hitler was furious. He screamed at his generals, demanded executions for officers who had failed to demolish the bridge, and ordered the Luftwaffe to destroy it at any cost. For 10 days, German jets, V-2 rockets, and artillery shells rained down on the Ludendorff Bridge. None of it worked. Despite heavy damage, the bridge stood long enough for thousands of Allied soldiers, tanks, and vehicles to cross. By the time it finally collapsed on March 17th, the Allies already held a massive bridgehead across the Rhine, and Germany's fate was sealed. But the Germans didn't know that. Not yet. Thanks to the Ghost Army's deception to the north, Hitler and his generals believed the bridge at Remagen was only a diversion, a small crossing meant to distract from the real invasion they expected near Düsseldorf and Viersen. They poured men, tanks, and artillery into the wrong sector, leaving the actual Allied spearhead almost unopposed. Every hour the Germans spent preparing for a battle that would never come was an hour the real Allied armies used to move deeper into Germany. It was warfare as theater, and the Ghost Army had bought front-row seats for the Allies' final act. By late March, the Rhine, once Hitler's proudest natural defense, had been crossed in 6 different locations. British forces surged east from Wesel. Patton's Third Army thundered across at Oppenheim, and the Americans at Remagen kept pouring through. In less than 2 weeks, the last great barrier of Nazi Germany had fallen, and the race to Berlin had begun. The soldiers of the Ghost Army knew their mission had worked. They could see the evidence in every intercepted German transmission, every reconnaissance photo that still showed their fake tanks in place. The enemy was chasing shadows. The war was turning real again and ending fast. In his diary, one Ghost Army member wrote, "We fought a battle that didn't exist, and somehow it saved thousands who did." The deception had been complete. The Germans defended an illusion, and the Allies crossed into history. Chapter 6. The Men Behind the Masks. They were soldiers who carried paintbrushes instead of rifles, loudspeakers instead of guns, and sketchbooks instead of maps. They called themselves the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, but history would come to know them by another name. The Ghost Army. Officially activated in January 1944, this 100-man unit was unlike any other in the U.S. Army. Its members were artists, set designers, sound engineers, and radio men handpicked from art schools, advertising agencies, and film studios across America. Many had studied at Yale, Pratt, or the Art Students League of New York. Some had painted Broadway sets. Others had recorded jazz albums or designed department store windows. But in 1944, their creativity was turned into a weapon. The Ghost Army's job was not to kill. It was to confuse, distract, and deceive. They were the Army's illusionists, an entire unit dedicated to making the enemy believe something that wasn't real. Their motto wasn't written in any official manual, but everyone in the 23rd knew it by heart. If you can to be strong, appear strong. The recruits trained under strict secrecy at Camp Forest, Tennessee. There, among rolling hills and pine forests, they practiced the art of tactical theater. Painters learned to assemble inflatable tanks and trucks, covering seams with paint to mimic armor plates. Set designers studied how shadows behaved at sunrise and dusk to make rubber artillery pieces look solid from the air. Sound engineers recorded actual tank movements on 16-inch acetate discs, then replayed them through massive amplifiers capable of projecting noise up to 15 miles away. Radio operators practiced creating fake traffic, learning how to mimic the chaotic chatter of entire divisions. To the untrained eye, it might have looked absurd, a circus pretending to be an army. But behind every brushstroke and sound cue was deadly purpose. The Captain Fred Fox, one of the Unit S early planners, once told his men, "Your mission is to save lives by pretending to risk them." That was the paradox of the Ghost Army. They operated on the front lines, often within artillery range of the enemy, not to fight, but to pretend to fight. In Normandy, they simulated an armored division to cover the real 1S withdrawal. In Belgium, they bluffed an entire corps into repositioning, forcing the Germans to attack empty ground. By the time they reached the Rhine, their deception had become so refined that entire enemy armies were maneuvering against nothing at all. Jog, the men behind the illusions, were not hardened warriors. Many were barely out of art school. One, Bill Blass, would go on to become a world-famous fashion designer. Another, Ellsworth Kelly, would redefine modern art. But in 1945, these future icons were living in mud and camouflage, sketching fake tanks while artillery shells whistled overhead. One soldier, Arthur Shilstone, later said, "We were artists playing soldiers, but the act became real when we realized our deceptions were saving lives." Every operation required precision choreography. Inflatable tanks were placed by map grid, painted to match real camouflage patterns of nearby divisions, and oriented to cast convincing shadows under reconnaissance lighting. Sound trucks followed set routines, idling, revving, and halting in rhythm with the fake Army S movements. And the radio teams, the most critical element of all, kept up an unbroken stream of believable chatter, right down to invented gossip about officers and rations. It was war as performance art, and every scene could mean the difference between life and death for the men fighting nearby. The Ghost Army operated in over 20 major deceptions across France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Germany. Their illusions shielded real divisions like Patton's Third Army, confused German scouts, and misdirected entire offensives. Military historians estimate their work saved tens of thousands of Allied lives. But when the war ended, their mission was buried under classified files. Every man was sworn to secrecy. For more than 50 years, their story remained invisible, just like the illusions they created. One of them later reflected, "We weren't heroes in the normal sense, but every time the Germans bombed an empty field instead of a real one, that was our victory, and it was a victory built not from firepower, but from imagination." Chapter 7, The Final Illusion. March 1945. The Rhine River, the last great barrier of Hitler's Reich, had been breached. But to secure the Allied bridgeheads, a final act of deception was needed. An illusion so convincing that it would hold back entire German divisions for just a few more critical days. This was Operation Viersen, the Ghost Army S masterpiece. The Mission S objective was simple but audacious. Make the Germans believe that two full U.S. divisions, the 30th and 79th Infantry, were preparing to cross the Rhine near the town of Viersen. In reality, the real crossing was already underway, 50 miles to the south. The Ghost Army would stage a massive fake invasion to pull the enemy S attention north, a performance designed not for cameras, but for reconnaissance planes, radio intercepts, and the human fear of what might be coming next. They had only a few days to build an entire phantom army. By March 18th, the flatlands near Viersen were transformed. Empty fields became motor pools filled with inflatable Sherman tanks. Rubber trucks lined fake supply roads, their tarps carefully dusted with mud to appear weathered. Canvas tents stretched across the horizon with smoke pots burning to simulate campfires. From the air, it looked like an invasion force of 20,000 men preparing to attack. From the ground, even through binoculars, it looked real enough to fool a trained eye. But the visuals were only one layer of the illusion. Sound engineers from the 3100 Signal Company set up giant speakers, each capable of projecting 500 watts of battlefield noise. Through the night, they blasted recordings of tank engines, construction machinery, and shouted orders filling the darkness with the soundscape of an army on the move. Local German spies reported hearing it. So did German patrols, and within hours their reports made their way to Army headquarters. The illusion was working. Meanwhile, the radio teams began transmitting. They recreated the unique rhythm and tone of the real 30th and 79th Division's chatter. Every pause, every code word, every meaningless logistical message. German intelligence picked it up immediately. According to post-war archives, they concluded that major Allied forces were massing opposite the Rhine in the Viersen sector. Orders went out. Reinforcements were to be moved north to block the coming attack. They never reached the real battlefield. As the Germans rushed to defend against the Phantom Army, the actual Allied forces Montgomery S. and Simpson S. divisions poured across the Rhine near Wesel and Remagen, facing far less resistance than expected. While the world would later remember those crossings as feats of engineering and courage, few realized that part of their success came from an army that didn't exist. The Ghost Army had bought them time, the most precious commodity in war. On the night of March 23rd, as the real armies surged eastward, the Ghost Army began dismantling their creation. The rubber tanks were deflated, the fake radio chatter ceased, and the sound trucks fell silent. By dawn, only footprints and tire tracks remained, the perfect ending to a performance meant to disappear. The German army, still convinced the attack was imminent, held its positions for another 48 hours. When reconnaissance finally confirmed the area was empty, it was too late. The Allies had already crossed the Rhine and were advancing deep into Germany. In the chaos of war, Operation Viersen was just another entry in the daily situation reports. But for the men of the Ghost Army, it was the culmination of everything they had trained for, the final proof that deception, done right, could be as powerful as firepower. Lieutenant Fred Fox summed it up best in his report. We fought not with bullets, but with belief. And belief was enough. But when the operation ended, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops quietly packed up their equipment and moved west. No medals, no public thanks. Their success depended on never being known. It would take nearly half a century before their story was finally declassified. One veteran later said, "We left behind no graves, no ruins, no monuments, only confusion. And that's how we won." Epilogue. The army that wasn't there. When the war finally ended in May 1945, Europe erupted in celebration flags, fireworks, freedom. But in one small, nameless camp in Germany, a group of men quietly deflated their last rubber tank, rolled up their canvas roads, and drove home without fanfare. No one cheered for them. No medals waited. Their victories were invisible because their very existence was supposed to be. They were the Ghost Army, and their greatest accomplishment was making the enemy believe they were someone else entirely. In the years that followed, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops simply disappeared into civilian life. Painters returned to their easels. Sound engineers went back to radio stations. A few became famous. Bill Blass built a fashion empire. Ellsworth Kelly became one of the most celebrated modern artists of the 20th century. But when asked about their wartime service, they said nothing. They couldn't. Their mission remained classified for over 50 years. Even their families didn't know what they had done. Decades later, historians would begin piecing together the truth from fragments, old field reports, faded photos, and veterans who, in their final years, finally began to talk. What emerged was one of the most remarkable untold stories of World War II. An entire army built on illusion, whose power came not from destruction, but from deception. They saved lives not by fighting, but by pretending to. One Ghost Army veteran, Jack Macy, said it best in an interview before his death. "We didn't kill anyone, but we probably saved thousands, and that is the paradox that defines their legacy." A group of artists who turned creativity into a weapon, who fought hate with imagination, and who proved that war could be won with paint, sound, and light as surely as with bombs and bullets. In 2013, almost 70 years after the end of the war, Congress finally recognized their service. The Ghost Army received the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the highest civilian honors in the United States. It was a long overdue tribute to a unit that had fought shadows with shadows and won. Their story reminds us of something profound, that even in humanity's darkest hour, creativity can be a weapon of light. That deception, when wielded for life rather than death, can save more than any bullet ever could. The Ghost Army didn't leave behind monuments or memorials, just quiet fields in France and Germany, where fake tanks once stood and real soldiers lived because of them. As one veteran wrote in his final letter home, "Our art was never meant for museums. It was meant to save men's lives." And it did. After this moment, take a second to remember them, the artist who painted an army that wasn't there. If you enjoyed this untold story, please like the video, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from, because history, like their illusions, only lives when someone sees it. Stay healthy, stay curious, and as always, your voice helps keep their memory alive.